Manushi, and I'm part of Google Talk Team, and I'm also a developer at Google. So today we are going to discuss Scott and Carolyn's book, Wired to Create. Scott is the scientific director of the Imagination Institute in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He conducts research on the measurement and development of imagination, creativity, and play, and teaches the popular undergrad course, which is Introduction to Positive Psychology. And he's also host of the Psychology podcast and co-founder of the Creative Post, and he writes blog Beautiful Minds in Scientific American. Carolyn is New York-based journalist and author. She's currently a senior writer at the Huffington Post, and she reports on health and science. Her writing has also appeared in Scientific American, CNN, and other publications. And she's discussed her work on MSNBC, Today Show, and the History Channel. So please welcome Scott and Carolyn. So their book, Wired to Create, offers a glimpse inside the messy minds of highly creative people. So let's get started with book introduction from Scott and Carolyn.
Thank you.
Hey guys, welcome. Can you hear me okay? All the guys all over back there? We wrote this book called Wired to Create. I am a scientist. I've been on this mission for a very long time to understand what is the nature of human intelligence, what is the nature of human creativity, how does it work in the brain, how can we develop it in people, how can we kind of appreciate it more in society. You know, there seems to be a bias against creativity in schools and in certain workplaces. I assume not Google at all. You guys seem very progressive. I just went to the bathroom and there was a woman right next to me in the bathroom, and that was okay. So it's a very progressive place. And it's a unisex bathroom. So to explain that. But and all these sorts of questions of like, what is creativity really? You know, how can we really promote it and stimulate it? Is it just a soft skill, or is it something that is deeper and more important? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Carolyn. Scott and I co-wrote this book, and we were motivated by all of these questions that Scott mentioned, but primarily the question of what makes highly creative people different from everyone else. And so this kind of exploration took us through, decades worth of personality psychology, starting with a really interesting experiment that was done in the 60s by a researcher named Frank Barron. And so he invited all of these eminent creative minds, Truman Capote, William Carlos Williams, Frank O'Connor, to stay in this frat house on the UC Berkeley campus. But they weren't playing beer pong. They were doing much more fun things like answering personality tests and tests of mental illness and all kinds of different examinations of the way that they think and feel and behave, and questions about their life circumstances. And what he found was a pretty big insight at the time, even though it may not sound like it today, but that creativity and intelligence are not the same thing. So that was kind of the jumping off point of this book, is if creativity is not intelligence, then what is it really? And so, we looked to explain the special spark of creative genius. And at least in that study, Barron found a few central characteristics, which were these highly creative people were very open to their own inner lives. They had a very high tolerance for disorder, for complexity, for chaos, for ambiguity. They had this desire to make meaning out of chaos. They were nonconformists. They were unconventional risk takers. They were kind of originals and very individual. So he found this very messy mix of things, which is where we kind of got this idea of, one of the places we got this idea of the messy minds of the highly creative person is that they can't be boiled down to one single thing. So it's this complex sort of host of characteristics that seem to inform creativity.
Totally. We want to rebrand, and having a messy mind is like a good thing. Like in schools, we promote efficiency, right? We say, okay, well, you have to do well on this test, and you can't revise it. You have to do well on this standardized test. But we don't appreciate when we study these creative geniuses or these great creators. You see that they're not characterized by their efficiency. They're characterized by their variability. They're characterized by their trial and error, their risk taking, their openness to experiences, their sensitivity. And a lot of times, their sensitivity can seemingly get in the way of their creative process, but you find that it is through reconciling all of these contradictions within themselves that you find creativity is most likely to emerge. We also found lots of contradiction with introversion and extroversion. Raise your hand if you're an introvert. No, I'm not going to do that. But a lot of you in this room might identify. Raise your hand if you've read Susan Cain's book, Quiet. I'll ask that. Well, you all should totally read that after you read Wired to Create. She's wonderful, and she wrote this book about why it's important to understand introversion and what it is, and give people opportunities who aren't necessarily the first one to speak at the meeting, for instance, or the one who doesn't like to be put on the spot to come up with answers. And a big part of what we learned through this scientific investigation of creativity is that a lot of great creativity comes through solitude, it comes through daydreaming, it comes through things that we don't promote in our school system and often in the workplace.
Like Scott was saying, introversion and extroversion was a central sort of contradiction that we explored as within a series of paradoxes seen in highly creative people. There was a really interesting study done on heavy metal musicians, which found that they actually were very sensitive and introverted and say things, backstage like they need lots of time by themselves and they enjoy daydreaming and engaging in like a world of fantasy, and that they are easily disrupted by loud noises, which is a very strange thing to hear from a heavy metal musician. But this, again and again, in the lives of different types of creative people, we see these very startling contrasts. So these heavy metal musicians were very bold and brash on stage, and that was very much something that a part of themselves and something that they enjoyed doing. So they did have extroversion in that sense and charisma, but they were also very shy, very often isolated, sensitive, introverted. And so these contradictions are pretty much across the board present in people who have eminent creative work that they've done. And this is partly because, it's possible that the sort of inner tensions that we feel within ourselves give rise to the desire to create. And it's actually been found that creative writers score both in the top 10% of the general population on tests of mental illness and also in the top 15% on tests of mental health. So how is that possible? Yeah. It may be that people who are driven to create just are more sort of open to this broad sense of themselves. They're more intimate with both the dark and the light within themselves. And that may be sort of a catalyst for creative exploration, for creativity as a way of trying to understand themselves.
Yeah, we're starting to see this a bit in the brain. We're doing neuroscience research. Do we have anyone in this room who's interested in neuroscience at all? Excellent. We found that 3 major brain networks are important for the creative process. Traditionally, what's called the executive attention network has been considered the most important one, and the executive attention network it involves your ability to focus on the outside world, to hold lots of different bits of information in your head at once and integrate them. When you're programming, when you're really focusing, like let's say you're going through like 5,000 lines of code to find that one mistake, the executive attention network is extremely important. But a very underrated brain network that's been discovered in recent years is called the default mode brain network. It was discovered accidentally by cognitive neuroscientists because cognitive neuroscientists weren't interested in what was going on in your own head while you were taking being part of an experiment that wasn't related to the actual experiment. So if the experiment is like, is this line bigger than this line, or give me this boring, comprehend this boring reading comprehension passage, any of your daydreaming, any of your fantasies, your future thoughts, strivings, all that was considered noise in the laboratory. Until recently, some really, am I allowed to say badass neuroscientists were like, we wonder if there's any value at all to what's going on by default in their head. What is that cognition when we're not telling them what to do? And it opened up this whole new line of research in cognitive neuroscience, this discovery of the default mode network. We like to call it the imagination brain network, because it turns out this network is not just associated with daydreaming and mind wandering and imagination, but it's also associated with making meaning out of your experiences. When you disrupt this brain network, you find that you also see disruptions in sense of self, and your capacity to create a narrative about your life and make meaning. Of course, maybe it's not of course, but did you know that the self is a construction? It's not actually a thing, a real thing, or we haven't at least discovered it physically. There's the self. There's this is a very age-old question. But what we do know is real is our self-concept, and it's constantly being revised our self-concept is constantly being revised by other people's opinions of us and by our own opinions of ourselves, which is very important, influences how we engage with others in the world. And you find this imagination is very important for that, that natural process. So we find those two brain networks are really important. And there's a third brain network that is very underrated. It's called the salience brain network, and that's associated with your ability, not your ability, but motivation. Like how much do things in your environment capture your attention? His salience network wasn't activated in this talk, but maybe, I don't know. But the salience network is really important for helping to tag things as relevant or irrelevant. So if you're in a really boring lecture or you're in like a boring most of us in school were forced to pay attention to a teacher, and that salience network has passed the baton over to the imagination network, and that's when we start daydreaming and mind wandering. But when that salience network says, wow, that's really interesting, then it passes the baton over to the executive attention network, and that's when we really can focus. So in a lot of ways, the key to everything in life is activating that salience network, which is at a subconscious level. And it also is influenced through our learning process and our past experiences.
Yeah, and so where that comes in with like the personality contradictions is that in most people, the sort of external attention network and the internal default mode network are at odds. We're either using one or we're using the other, depending on the situation and the task at hand. But in creative people, something really interesting is happening, or when people are engaged in creative work and develop, these creative skills, these brain networks actually harmonize, and there's like a rapid sort of switching between the networks, and people become very well equipped at using them together. So it's kind of like these opposites coming together, even on the level of neurology. So we see, in the level of the brain and the personality and the creative process, which also tends to be kind of back and forth and is not a linear progression for most people. I'm sure many of us can relate to, procrastinating and doing nothing on a project, and then suddenly it all comes at once. Or yeah, maybe not you guys. You made it to Google, so.
You can't like Google can't be shut down for a day because you guys procrastinated. Like we need you. Like you've got how many million people every 20 seconds? What does it say up there?
And even Picasso, like late in his career, when he had made thousands of paintings, his process still didn't look to be what you would expect from a seasoned painter. He would kind of go back and forth, and he would create sketches that sometimes would have a sort of linear progression, and then he would go back to the earliest one and then put that in the painting, and it would seem to be this process more of blind experimentation than any sort of logical, orderly sort of process.
Yeah, let me tell them about a study that came out after a book was published that is really interesting. We're kind of having a new understanding of personality and the way it works. Raise your hand if you think the way personality works is it's something that you have these stable dispositions that don't really change that much throughout your life. Raise your hand if you think that's okay. Okay, good. So it turns out that through the course of our day, like I feel like I can get really technical with this audience, and you guys will really get me. So I'm just going to be technical. So the way we think of personality now is density distributions. So each one of us has a density distribution for a whole wide range of traits. But what that means is that it's kind of like you have a bell curve throughout the day of, like no one is purely extroverted or purely introverted. And what you see is that within a person, you actually cycle through every introverted, extroverted behavior. We're at the core, we're all human, So how you have people who say like, I'm an introvert, and they're so proud of it, and it's like, that's who I am, and I'm never an extrovert. But if you actually follow them throughout the day, like scientifically, you follow them throughout the day and you have them report their things, you find they act extrovert a lot more than they're willing to admit, What you do see though is that their density distribution is they're skewed much more towards the introverted side on average, well, not even average, just in terms of a skew of a distribution. And we're starting to extend that now to things like that have normally been non-clinical traits, like narcissism, for instance, things like schizophrenia. It actually turns out that these things, we're breaking down the boundaries of what these things mean between, there's the clinical people that we put in the mental institution who have that, and then there are the rest of us who are, we're non-clinical, we're good. But we're not good, or they're not bad, is how I'd prefer a positive spin on it. And so how this relates is that when you look at the brain, you find that actually there's a lot of similarities between schizophrenic patients and creative people when you ask them to solve creative tasks. That's where I'm going with this. I wanted to tie it all together. You actually find there's a lot of similarities. Where the differences are is when you follow them throughout the course of a day. And you find that actually creative people are more able to return to reality. They're equally as capable of jumping out and taking a risk and thinking really imaginatively and quote psychotically. But what they're able to do throughout their day is their density distribution of schizophrenia is much less skewed, to the one end than the other for schizophrenic patients. And that's just a new emerging way of thinking about personality. I think is going to have profound implications in the coming years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and going back to this finding that creative writers were sort of both more mentally ill and more mentally healthy than other people. I think part of the mentally ill aspect, or mentally ill, but part of the aspect that is related to mental illness is so something called schizotypy is a spectrum of ranging on one end, which is sort of imaginativeness, and on the other, full-blown schizophrenia. And so what's been found is that highly creative people may have just some of the more positive traits associated with schizophrenia without the more harmful ones. So that would be things like magical thinking and a tendency to see patterns and to find order in disorder, and very unusual perceptions or heightened perceptions. So maybe if they were listening to chimes, like they would hear more sound in the chimes than the average person would. And so these are things that our society associates with mental illness, but I mean, thinking of this list of traits, do they really seem so negative? And can that actually maybe lead us to reconsider mental illness and how we treat, mental disorders in our culture?
Absolutely. Did we want to do a Q&A, or how are we doing on time?
So thank you so much for the introduction. Reading your books, there were some questions I did have, and then we can have open Q&A for everyone. Sure. So we generally consider the creative mind restricted to a select group of artists, scientists, or writers, or musicians. Why do you suggest that personal creativity is important for everyone's sense of being? It's important for everyone's sense of well-being, not just few selected creative artists.
Yeah, we talked about well-being in the book a little bit, so that's an exciting question. Do you want to cover that? Or?
Yeah, I think creativity is just kind of a natural part of who we are, and we see this like in the case of children at play. Like play is not a thing that some children do and some children don't. It's actually a natural and healthy and very important part of child development. And when there is not play, there's a problem. And so, from that and from other research, we can kind of deduce that creativity is just a fundamental human characteristic. And so, it doesn't always take the form of a Picasso or a genius musician, but creativity is just, we define it as, well, I guess science defines it. We should define creativity first.
Yeah,
science defines it as novelty and usefulness. And so we kind of define it broadly as just bringing something new into the world, whether that's a new idea or just a new way of seeing a problem or a new way of presenting something. There's so many forms creativity can take and so many everyday forms that it does take, from what we choose to wear and put something together in a different way to the way that we phrase just even a sentence in an email that has a little bit more personal meaning. You can't, I think everyone is creative, and you can't really escape creativity when you look at it in that sense. And so the more we do exercise it and the more we do sort of bring new things into the world and bring some sort of self-expression into what we do, generally the more joy that we'll have in our lives.
Yeah, there's definitely research showing that everyday forms of creativity is correlated with feeling vitality in life, optimism, a sense of meaning in your life. So it's very true. And at the highest levels, at the genius level, it is a myth that mental illness is required for creativity. I want to be very clear about that. But what you find is an association, because a lot of people who have had very harsh childhood experiences, they're actually overrepresented in creative fields. People who've had some hardships in their childhood is actually overrepresented in the history books. And a lot of psychologists are trying to figure out why. Like, what's going on there? Like, is it that you need to have hardships in order to be creative? And it turns out that these hardships create a sense of otherness in them that allows them to see a world in a different way, allows them to kind of step back. And also it gives them more confidence to take risks, because they're like, oh, well, what do I have to lose? Like I've already lost it all pretty much, So, they're much more willing to take risks, much more. And also another thing is that a lot of creative people who've had hardships, there's an emerging field called post-traumatic growth that we talk about in the book. So a lot of them use their hardships to grow creatively. So a lot of creative writers will put it into their will put it into their work. They'll write about it in their work. I'm trying to think right now in my head how you could post-traumatic growth. How do you put it into your code? I don't know. I guess you guys can give me some ideas what that would look like. How can you, take out all your frustrations on the code that you're doing? I'd love to hear that. But you do find in a whole wide range of creative fields, a lot of people have had these hardships, and creativity is healing for them. There's art therapy, there's all these emerging fields where creativity can be very healing. Journaling, as we talk about journaling in the book, has been shown to be really important for healing trauma. So I wanted to make that point.
Thank you. So throughout the book, you always mention like messy minds and messy brains, messy emotions of the creative
messy,
people.
yeah.
Everything's messy. So what are the conflicting mental states that creativity draws upon that you can think of?
Well, we're talking about that a little bit with the brain activation. So you have what's called spontaneous cognition. You have more controlled cognition. You have more reflective. We talk about intuition in the book and why that's important, and drawing on your intuition to a certain degree, drawing on your personal experiences. We talk about mind wandering. And then I'll pass the baton to you, Carolyn, talk a little about mindfulness.
Yeah, so one of the other contradictions we explore is mindfulness and daydreaming. Daydreaming is really important for creativity because it's activating the default mode network. So often, we'll come up with an insight when the mind is just wandering. This is why so many people actually do come up with great ideas in the shower, because it's this place where your mind is just kind of like mellowing, but it's kind of at work in the background. You're maybe like thinking about something, but not too hard, and then something completely unrelated comes into your mind. So daydreaming, that's a whole other can of worms, but it's very critical to creative thinking.
I did an international study on showers, and more people reported great creative insights in the shower than they did at work.
So daydreaming is pretty critical to the creative thinking processes, but mindfulness is as well. It's easy to see how we need to be able to focus and to pay attention and to really sustain our attention on whatever we're doing in order to actually do creative work. So we kind of need daydreaming for this idea generation, and then mindfulness for actually making our ideas become a reality. And so these kind of thinking processes can be at odds, but creative people do tend to find a kind of synthesis between them.
With that said, yeah, we're talking about, we debate often a lot whether expert mindful people, are they creative? And that's still a question open for debate, but the research is kind of mixed in that, showing that too much mindfulness on the outside world or too much focus does limit your creative potential in a lot of ways if you don't have that flexibility to go back in and daydream as well about what you've learned. So that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and actually certain types of meditation are better than others when it comes to stimulating creative thinking. So does anyone practice TM? Or transcendental meditation? No? Oh, I'm surprised.
Does anyone do meditation
or meditate
in any
general?
form?
Okay. So forms of meditation that sort of encourage awareness of the internal thought processes. Like we can be mindful to actually our own thoughts and our own imagination. We usually think of mindfulness as being mindful to the external world, to the present moment in terms of our immediate surroundings. But some types of meditation, like transcendental meditation and open monitoring meditation, encourage becoming sort of more mindful of everything that's in our internal landscape. So there is an ability to sort of allow the mind to wander, to pay attention to that, and then to bring it back. And these types of meditations, more so than like a very strict, intense, like Zen meditation where you're focusing just very intensely on some external object, these tend to be more effective for creativity because they're bringing together those two thinking processes.
Thank you. I would also like to open the floor for anyone if you have any Q&A questions. If not, then okay, sure.
I'm wondering what, from this knowledge, what is the actionable thing that we can do?
It's a fair question. Fair question. Scientists cringe a little bit when they get that question because they're like, "That's not what I do. That's not why I do what I do," right? But people want to know, And we talk about some actionable things in this book. And I think the best way to think about it is creativity as a way of being in the world. Like, don't think of the creativity as only this like thing that geniuses do, or that it's a way of relating to your world. And we really feel to the extent to which you follow these kind of 10 things in this book we talk about, you are in effect living a creative lifestyle, and you're increasing the chances there'll be creative insights that, it's very important to build time into your day to have solitude. Like too many meetings is going to stifle creativity if there are any project managers listening to that. And it's really important to constantly push yourself out of your comfort zone, and constantly we have a whole chapter on openness to new experiences and how that's going to be really super important. We build in time to daydream and construct reflect, journal about your experiences and really get a chance to understand that. What are some other things?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is openness to experience, which we have a big chapter on. And this is actually a personality trait that's the #1 predictor of creative achievement across all fields in arts and science. And so this can take a lot of different forms, but really any sort of new experiences or new ways of approaching things, or even walking a different way to work, that sounds so trivial, but just getting your brain rewiring your brain patterns and getting into a different state actually makes a very big difference, and it can sort of on subtle levels and then eventually on larger levels change the way that you think and give way to new ideas. So people actually who have studied abroad, they've done studies and found that they perform better on tests of creative thinking after college students, study abroad, and people who, what are some of the other ones?
Immigrants.
Immigrants tend to bring this influx of art and culture into a new place, which stimulates a broader societal-wide kind of shifts in thinking and in art and science and tech and that kind of thing.
The big thing is to keep cycling through your mindsets, your modes of thinking. Keep cycling all throughout the day. Don't get stuck on if you're focusing on a problem and you're all okay, let's stay up all night and we're going to solve this and we're not leaving until we solve this problem. That's very unlikely you're going to solve the problem that night. It is really important to have that time to cycle through these different mental states, because we know that's how creativity works in the brain.
Thank you.
Okay, so it sounds like diversity of new experiences is really important to help train creativity, and that. I think you mentioned journaling a few different times. One as a way to deal with trauma, and also as a way to, I think, improve creativity. Did you say that? Could you elaborate a little more on journaling and its effect?
Yeah, what it requires is that you're actively and cognitively processing what has happened to you throughout the day, and that you're making meaning. You're trying to actually tie it to your life, your past experiences, your future experiences. Before you go to bed every night, we know in positive psychology, it's good to write and reflect on the things that went wrong during the day, and then say okay, well, what was the point what can I learn from that? Constantly be a problem-based mode, and then also write 3 good things that you're happy about that day before you go to bed. So it's called the 3 good things exercise that I teach my students in my positive psychology class, and that makes it much more likely that you'll wake up the next day feeling more ready and able to tackle the day. And you could see how that positive emotions, we know positive emotions are correlated with creativity and probability for creative thinking and insightful thinking. So to the extent to which you put that into your journals, that allows you to have fresh outlooks and perspectives on life, it's going to increase your creativity, I would think. Yeah. If you want specific exercises, you can email me though. I can. There's some great stuff by Pennebaker and others that get you started right away.
Cool, thank you.
By the way, I went to high school with these 3. One of them were, and it's so surreal that they're sitting there right now. It's they're really good friends.
Hi, Scott.
Hey.
What would you say makes society value or not value creativity? Why are there so many starving artists? Why do you hear about the painter who becomes famous only after his death? Why do we want to consume so much content but maybe not pay for it? What are some of your psychology thoughts on that?
I'm talking a lot.
I'll just jump in really quick.
I'm yakking.
I think we sort of value creativity in theory, as in we celebrate obviously great musicians and artists and innovators and kind of hold them up and put them on pedestals. But we tend to not look at what it took to actually get there and the sort of like challenges that are inherent and the failures that are inherent to the creative process. And especially you see this, I mean, in schools for sure, and also in a lot of organizations. I expect that Google is a little more progressive on this front, but most organizations say that they desire innovation and that they want creative new products, they want creative people, they want to do things differently, but they're actually completely unwilling to do, sort of they're unwilling to make the sacrifices that requires. So that's, allowing people to maybe have more freedom or,
pretty much choosing what project you want to work on.
Yeah, allowing people to sort of think about things in a new way or kind of write their own rules in some sense or, or just accepting failure as a path to doing something really differently. So really, I think in the workplaces and in schools is where we see that the most, yeah.
Yeah, and in schools for sure. So, I mean, we have this whole culture of standardized testing. So we teach to the test, and we don't have a revision process. Like there's something like you got a D, like you're like, okay, I'm screwed. I got a D. As opposed to, look, you didn't fail. You got a D. So there's stuff we can work on here. Like, we don't frame it that way in school. There's so many ways we could be framing things that make school like, oh, this is all about personal growth. This is all about, and our book is very much a personal growth oriented book, I will say. Would you agree that, this book is not about, I have utmost respect and recorded everything for my colleague, Angela Duckworth, and the work on grit and all that. It's very important work. But we also think that sometimes the process itself, without the goal oriented aspect of it, can be even more conducive to creativity than being specifically goal oriented.
Yeah, I think also our obsession with efficiency is kind of at odds with creative work, which is a bit more meandering and sort of doesn't always have a clear outcome. And this starts so early now. I think even preschool kids have so little free time, like 30% less than they did in the 70s, I think. So that's just not really, if we want people to sort of let their minds go and come up with new things and, just change the paradigm. It's not going to come from squeezing activities into slots and not trying to write a book in a really short period or come up with a new product in a ridiculously short period because you're just going and going and moving on to the next thing. That's just not really, creativity works in a completely different way.
Yeah, so. I mean, I hope this stuff doesn't, some of it may sound really corny, right, and really soft. If I said to you, you really should make in your day a play break, where you literally you're there's 45 minutes in the day you could call anyone at work and be like, let's play frisbee, When you think that's corny, right? You'd be like, oh, play. But there's research showing that actually the more that you build in a play mindset into work, the more that you come back and you're more likely to actually solve the problem, So I think it's stuff that really matters, even though we kind of look down on it. Yeah.
So I noticed most of the research seems to be done on artists, musicians, the fields we traditionally think of as creative. Is it because it's easier to study those sorts of
they want to be
manifestations?
Studied.
They want to be studied.
They love being artists. Love it. Right.
So I'm wondering,
tell me more about myself. Sorry.
Is the research done on those manifestations of creativity applicable to maybe the sorts that we're more interested here, in terms of solving technical or scientific problems?
Totally fair question. I think so. I mean, I've looked at research on the sciences, so we don't just look at the arts, but I've also looked at research in the sciences, and we find that intellectual curiosity is a very strong predictor of creative achievement in the sciences, much more than in the arts. The arts, openness to experience was more important, but we find that more higher level, abstract sort of love of reasoning, love of intellectual curiosity, coming up with lots of different possibilities and really being open in an intellectual way is a much better predictor of scientific achievement. So we found that. I don't know if there's any real in-depth longitude study of computer scientists. To me, I don't know if that's ever been, such a study has been done. Although I lived with a computer scientist for a couple of years, and I have some case studies, but I don't know if any real, yeah.
I was curious, have you encountered any research on people using lucid dreaming to tap into their creative sources?
The next question is going to be about drugs, isn't it? This is the gateway question is always the lucid dreaming, and then the next one's always LSD. Admit it, someone had that waiting. Lucid dreaming is a fascinating phenomenon, and it is possible to train yourself. It's not guaranteed if you train yourself, but the normal areas of the brain and remember I was talking about the executive attention network? Well, that's normally silent when we're dreaming. And that's why our dreams tend to be so bizarre, because there's no higher order control that is making it organized. So it's sort of like every person for themselves in your dreams, like anything goes, and then you wake up and you're like horrified that you just had that dream, you're like, I'm not telling anyone about that one. But you can actually train in a lucid way to activate your executive attention network during dreaming. And it's really surreal when you do that, like literally surreal, because you're like, I'm able to take an active role in organizing the structure of this dream right now. I'm going to, I'm going to walk through that door right now, in the dream, you're like, I'm going to, and people can be trained to do that. It's fascinating. Now, to the extent, you didn't ask this question, but I am curious, like the extent to which are lucid dreamers more creative? And that's an interesting question. And I don't think any study has ever been done on that, but there is some emerging research on LSD and creativity, if anyone's interested in that, which Carolyn can talk about.
Well, I was actually just going to, oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay. Well, another thing, sleep-related, or dreaming-related, rather, thing is hypnagogia is this state between sleep and wakefulness. Like, I don't know if you ever, this sometimes happens to me when I'm meditating, which probably means I'm not a very good meditator, but when you are sort of on almost asleep and your brain is just in that place where it's like spitting nonsense, that is actually like a really creatively fertile time, because your brain is going into REM, but you also, it's like cycling through things that have happened in the day, like memories and ideas and all of these things. So you have sort of like the benefits of sleep in terms of like loosening cognitive control, but then also like your mind is still active. So this is like, a lot of people have tried to harness this. I think Dolly did some sort of weird experiment where he like took a nap and had like something roll down his hand slowly, and then when it fell, like he would wake up. So he caught himself in that state before he actually fell asleep. So that's kind of an interesting thing to pay attention to. It can be difficult to remember the insights of that time, but it's kind of it's like your brain is loosening the control and like the filter, and more is coming in. So, it's worth paying attention to and exploring a little bit.
Yeah, also like 2 glasses of wine improves your creativity as well. Like it is good to reduce the executive functions a little bit, but not completely. Yeah.
So besides drugs and meditation, what can you do to train yourself to lose control and become more creative?
There are cutesy little exercises that scientists are working on. Yeah, it is a great question. There's the science of creativity in terms of developing it is an underdeveloped field. We've just done, at the Imagination Institute where I work, we've just done a $3 million grant competition where we had people from all over the world try to provide us with their ideas and how we can improve imagination and measure it as well. And the results of those projects, which are listed on the Imagination website, will be out next year. And I hope that we're giving them money. I hope they did something interesting, and so we'll see next year what they found. But there are some kind of like cutesy exercises. There are some exercises where people, have you guys heard of like de Bono and stuff, like lateral thinking exercise and things? And there are exercises you can do where you can actively like put through like a random word generator, various words, things that you're working on, your project you're working on, and then you have to like, as an exercise, like think of how are these 3 related to each other, and like think creatively about that. The point is that you want to get your creative juices stimulated, right? That didn't sound good, but you want to get it. You really want to get in that mind. And so much of it is a mindset, and you find that creativity really does get blocked when you get too serious, too down one garden path. Creativity is like a spreading activation model in the brain. You're going to be most likely to access the most remote associations. So there are exercises you can do to get it kind of like on the spot, make sure that if you feel like you're getting too down a single path to stimulate it. But I hope we can come up with better things than that.
I don't know, maybe like hypnosis or something. Like if you're looking at specifically that sort of loosening that occurs with like psychedelics and dreaming and that kind of thing. I can think of as maybe like hypnosis and breath work, but I'm not necessarily suggesting those things. But it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, thank you. There was one question that I did have is, it was once believed that creativity was restricted to the right side of the brain, but the understandings have changed now. What else has changed recently, like after the book was published, or like just that you would want to mention?
Well, really, like what we're talking about, these large-scale brain networks is a much better way of thinking about how creativity happens than left brain and right brain. There are some interesting lateral specialization effects. So we do know that the right side of the brain does tend to process more nonverbal, artistic, and the left brain kind of more language. But with that said, the whole creative process seems to draw on these large-scale brain networks that operate in the left and the right side of the brain. And so it requires kind of a whole brain approach. I mean, when we actually, if I could show you a picture of what creativity looks like in the brain, it's throughout the whole process, it's pretty much every part is activated, at some point. Just like I said, and that's a nice way to tie together the whole messy minds thing as well. Just like I said, your personality, throughout the course of your day, you're actually, no matter even if you say I'm an introvert, I'm actually, or I'm agreeable or not agreeable, like even if you think you're a saint, even saints, if you follow them throughout the course of the day, they're jerks sometimes. So it's constantly cycling all throughout the thing and kind of being open and embracing that messiness of human personality structure.
Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It was great talking to you. It was very helpful. Thanks a lot, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks for inviting us.
There's
Thanks for
books in
coming,
the
guys.
back.